Hello, I'm Alex and welcome to the History Chronicles. If you like our work, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel in return for exclusive perks, please visit our Patreon page. Now, on with the video. Who was Cleopatra, and what was her ethnicity? Let's find out in today's episode of the History Chronicles. Today's History Chronicle begins in 46 BC in the city of Rome. The Roman civil war between Julius Caesar and the supporters of the deceased Pompeius Magnus was drawing to a conclusion. As it did, many individuals were arriving to the capital to pay homage to Caesar, who was now the effective ruler of Rome. Amongst them in 46 BC was Cleopatra VII, the queen or pharaoh of Egypt, which was one of the few Mediterranean states still partially independent of Rome. But Cleopatra was not just any ruler. She was Caesar's lover, and a year earlier had given birth to his only son, Caesarion. Cleopatra has been regularly depicted in films and paintings and other media ever since, generally as being white or European. But the question is, given her position as a North African ruler, was Cleopatra actually black? Cleopatra was born in 69 BC and was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The rulers of this dynasty were the descendants of King Ptolemy I, a general and close companion of Alexander the Great, who became ruler of Egypt when Alexander's empire fragmented into a number of successor states following the great conqueror's death in 323 BC. It should be noted that Ptolemy was Greek, Macedonian to be specific, and there is no doubt that he was white, though probably somewhat sallow or olive-skinned. However, he died in 282 BC, and there was over 200 years between his life and the birth of Cleopatra, during which the Ptolemaic line could have been greatly diluted. Cleopatra herself was a formidable character and one of the most consequential figures in the history of the late Roman Republic. By the time she was born, Egypt was already a client state of the Roman Republic, meaning it was a vassal to all intents and purposes, one which was a massive grain producer and the breadbasket of Rome. She ascended to the Egyptian throne in 51 BC at the age of 18 as co-ruler with her brother, Ptolemy XIII, whom she also married at this time in accordance with the common succession practice in Ptolemaic Egypt. However, conflict soon broke out between the two siblings. In 48 BC, Egypt was dragged into the Roman civil war when Caesar's rival for power, Pompeius Magnus, fled there after a major defeat by Caesar's armies at the Battle of Pharsalus in central Greece in August. However, Pompey was killed by the Egyptian authorities before Caesar ever arrived to pursue him, and Ptolemy XIII was also killed shortly thereafter, after which Cleopatra and her other brother, Ptolemy XIV, became the co-rulers. And now she entered a relationship with Caesar, one which lasted through to his assassination in Rome on the Ides of March in 44 BC. Caesar's death brought fresh complications and a fresh power struggle throughout the empire between Caesar's grandnephew and heir, Octavian, and one of Caesar's former generals, Mark Antony. Following their first meeting in 41 BC, Cleopatra entered into a relationship with Antony, one which lasted for the next 10 years. Eventually, in the final civil war of the Roman Republic, Octavian and Antony squared off against each other, culminating in the Battle of Actium, a major naval clash near Greece in 31 BC. Antony fled to Egypt and killed himself, and shortly afterwards, in August 30 BC, Cleopatra also took her own life. Not, as legend would have it, by being bit by an asp, but by drinking poison. This, in brief, was Cleopatra's eventful life and career. But before turning to consider what Cleopatra's ethnic descent might reveal about her appearance, we should stop here to consider how she has been depicted in modern times. Despite being an African queen, Cleopatra is typically depicted as being not just white, but very white. For instance, in Cleopatra, an American historical epic film of 1963, the Queen was played by Elizabeth Taylor. There was certainly no effort in the makeup department to make her skin tone look like that of a woman who came from a country which is effectively a desert punctuated by a large river running through the centre of it. Indeed, this tendency had emerged long before the 20th century, and already in the early modern period we find paintings by European artists which depict her as being quite pale-skinned. For instance, in both the 16th century Italian painter Gian Pietrino's Death of Cleopatra and Guido Cagnacci's rendering of the same scene from the 1640s, Cleopatra is painted as being very white, with just a touch of colour to her cheeks. What we need to ask, though, is whether these depictions are just slightly off in suggesting she was too white, or a gross misrepresentation of a black African queen. Much of the argument about Cleopatra's race stems from arguments which were first presented by the Jamaican-American journalist and writer Joel Augustus Rogers in his book World's Great Men of Color, which was published in 1946 and which, despite its title, discussed Cleopatra. Despite utilizing some spurious evidence, including supposedly first-hand evidence from the New Testament, which describes events which occurred over 50 years after Cleopatra's death, Rogers' thesis did open up a debate on the ethnicity of the Egyptian queen, which warrants some consideration, albeit not for the reasons cited by Rogers. There is no doubt that when Ptolemy I became ruler of Egypt in about 305 BC, he was a Hellenistic Macedonian, and the dynasty staunchly defined themselves as Greek. Moreover, they ruled over a kingdom which became quite Hellenized in due course, particularly so as Alexandria, the city which Alexander had founded in the Nile Delta, became a major Greek city and the most cosmopolitan city in the eastern Mediterranean at that time. Over time, Greeks became the majority population in what was the largest city in the world in the 2nd century BC. As such, it is not simply the case that this Macedonian family went to Egypt and just quickly intermarried with black Egyptians. It is far more nuanced than that, especially as the Egyptian skin colour varied between Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, and Nubia. The question is, exactly how diluted was the Ptolemaic bloodline by the 1st century BC when Cleopatra was born? Generally speaking, the descendants of Ptolemy did not marry with the Egyptian nobility or with the Nubian nobility of what was then southern Egypt, but which today encompasses northern Sudan. The latter would have had a particularly dark skin tone, and had the Ptolemaic kings and queens intermarried with these people far to the south, there would doubtlessly be much stronger evidence to suggest that Cleopatra was actually black or of a dark skin tone. In actuality, the dynasty largely intermarried with the royal families of the other dynasties which had succeeded to the thrones of Alexander's other successor kingdoms. In particular, they intermarried with the Seleucids, who were descended from Seleucus I Nicator, another of Alexander's companions and leading generals who had succeeded in acquiring the largest share of Alexander's conquests after his death, ruling everything from Syria and the Levant east through Mesopotamia and into Persia, and even large stretches of modern-day Turkey. The Seleucids did intermarry with the Medians and other peoples of their dominions, but these were also white, pale-skinned people. These marriage arrangements between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucids were in keeping with the general Ptolemaic tendency to view themselves as a colonial upper class in Egypt, one which ruled from the Hellenic city of Alexandria in the north of the country, rather than from the traditional pharaonic capitals of Cairo or Luxor further up the River Nile. Indeed, most members of the dynasty never even learned to speak Egyptian. Cleopatra herself was one of the very few exceptions to this rule, and the cultural rigidity is a further indication of the fact that it would have been considered inappropriate for a member of the royal family to marry with the Egyptian nobility. One of the core foundations for the argument that Cleopatra was black is the uncertainty regarding her maternal lineage. It is not 100% clear who her mother even was, and the parentage of the most likely candidate, Cleopatra V, is also quite murky, a fact which has led some to speculate that she was an Egyptian. Yet the most likely explanation is that she was a daughter of either Ptolemy IX or Ptolemy X, meaning she would again have been largely Macedonian, Hellenic, and white. This would seem to further substantiate the idea that Cleopatra was not black. Finally, there are the contemporary depictions of Cleopatra. Owing to her liaisons with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, Cleopatra became something of a celebrity figure in the early Roman imperial period, and she is noted by over 50 extant Roman writers. Unfortunately, these often focus on her supposed sexual allure without giving specifics about her skin colour. Nevertheless, Cleopatra is also widely depicted on coins, mosaics, and frescoes from throughout the Roman Empire in the centuries following her death. While some of these depictions are monochrome, in stone, bronze, or silver, some were intricately coloured and give us a good idea of what her skin tone might have been. The most authentic of these is surely found on the coinage which was issued in Egypt during Cleopatra's own lifetime. In classical times, rulers had a side profile of their faces depicted on the coins used in their kingdoms as a way of broadcasting their power as a ruler in an era without televisions. The images so used on these coins would have required royal approval, and so Cleopatra would have sanctioned the representation of herself on these coins. In them, she is portrayed as a traditional Greek woman wearing Greek dress and styling her hair in a Greek fashion. These coins do not suggest that she has any Egyptian or Nubian ancestry. Similarly, there are several marble portrait busts of Cleopatra extant from the early imperial period, each of which depicts the Egyptian queen as being of Hellenistic ancestry. For instance, the most famous, the so-called Berlin Cleopatra, which is on display today in the Altes Museum in Berlin, presents a picture of a woman who is clearly of Greek descent. There is no trace here of the traditional way in which Egyptian and Nubian female pharaohs have been portrayed in Egypt for centuries. Scholars have concluded that based on this bust, Cleopatra must have had dark hair and olive skin. Finally, there are surviving fresco images of Cleopatra which have survived in the ruins of Pompeii, when Mount Vesuvius buried the town in ash in 79 AD. An image of her from the house of Marcus Fabius Rufus in the town admittedly is highly stylized and tries to depict her as a Venus-type character. But nevertheless, there is no doubt from this image, which was painted and coloured, that Cleopatra was white and very much a woman of Greek ancestry. Several further frescoes in Pompeii depict her in an almost identical manner, and it seems clear that these are relatively accurate portrayals of the last pharaoh. In closing then, we might say that while Cleopatra's exact ethnicity will remain a matter of some contention, it seems overwhelmingly more likely that she was white rather than black. Despite ruling Egypt for 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty did not intermarry with the Egyptian and Nubian aristocracy, and its bloodline remained largely Macedonian Greek, with some Middle Eastern influences through their marriages with the Seleucids. Contemporary and near-contemporary depictions of Cleopatra universally corroborate this view. That said, while Cleopatra was probably not black, she was probably more sallow-skinned than Elizabeth Taylor. You have been watching the History Chronicles. We'd love to know what you think of Cleopatra. Do you think she was white or black? Please let us know below, and if you enjoyed our video, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Also, if you'd like to support our work going forward, please visit our Patreon page. We look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the History Chronicles.